Welcome to the February 16th, 2022 SMI community meeting. We have a couple of items to discuss, and then we can jump to some issue triage as well. I want to make sure we get to the items for discussion. We always have these best of intentions to, do issue triage first, which seems fine, except when we have items we want to talk about. So let's jump right into it. Keith, do you want to talk about traffic target?
Yes, it would be my pleasure to. So about, I don't know, maybe a month ago, created this a proposal document for changes to traffic target to make it more compliant with other meshes and more generally, just more generally useful. And a full, about to say a full week before the deadline, we have all the meshes I had spaces for submit information, which is really awesome. And I'm really excited about that. We'll still give any other meshes the opportunity to be able to add more information. But we already have several kind of explanations on how these meshes, the meshes represented, about 5 of them, handle authorization. So that's a lot of information for us to be able to use to come up with something with enhancements that make traffic target really useful. So thank you to all who are involved in that, getting the word out or filling out information. Even those of you not on this call, I really appreciate your involvement. I also, in kind of in line with it, but a bit separate, I've written another proposal document. It's linked in the bottom of the traffic target proposal document for a new SMI CRD or custom resource. I posted about it in Slack as well. I was thinking about kind of the problems that we encountered with traffic target and thought of, kind of personally saw a missing layer of abstraction when it comes to existing SMI resources. And so I present at this meeting a proposal for a CR called identity binding. I'll post that link for just ease of navigation, post it here in the Zoom chat, and that can be linked maybe in the meeting notes as well afterward for me. But identity binding is a custom resource that essentially the goal of it is to encapsulate what identifiers can be used to bind those identifiers to a particular service. A lot of meshes do this implicitly. Some use certificates to handle identity, others use service accounts. Some use labels and label selectors for identity. And so identity binding kind of creates a declarative way to essentially say that these are all the ways that this service can be referenced. If you see this SPIFFE identity, if you see anything with this Kubernetes label, or if you see anything with this service account, that's all this service. What this does is it allows us to keep a lot of the complexity of identification. We can keep that out of traffic target, and traffic target can focus more on the request response cycle. And this also will allow a lot more functionality for existing meshes to be able to be represented within an SMI. More information is laid out in the document, but the idea is that identity binding would try to represent well-known standards such as SPIFFE, Kubernetes pod label specs, etc. And that way, SMI doesn't get too coupled to a particular mesh implementation. And as those standards grow and as more standards become more widely adopted, things like OPA or any other identification specification, we can add that to identity binding as well. And even at some point, hopefully, lead the charge for new things being adopted. So I wanted to ask everybody's opinions about this and give it some time to sit and let the community see it. In particular, I'd like for OSM as well, to because I know there is some talk about on the OSM side about augmenting traffic targets. So I want to get everybody's thoughts. Sure, go ahead, Nick.
So I've just had a quick scan and it looks great to me. Like, I think your rationale is bang on. It provides a really simple way to kind of like aggregate what is an identity. So then it cleans up a lot of the other stuff. The only kind of, well, I've got two comments. One is that would we expect every service mesh to implement all of these capabilities? So for example, console, we use Spiffy, but the identity is not necessarily surfaced. You can find it out, like by kind of digging into the configuration, but the identity is basically it's an internal thing. So for console, we would use service account. That's kind of the mechanism that we use to tie kind of service identity in Kubernetes. Sorry, to our internal Spiffy account, and we can do that because the service account token is cryptographically verifiable, so that we're not kind of like given the correct RBAC rules, you can't masquerade a service mesh identity because you've got to have the ability to apply the correct service account. So that's kind of point one. So we would potentially only want to implement part of the specification. Now, point two kind of draws from why we would potentially only want to implement part of the specification. And that is around, say, pod label specifier. So this is a question. I'm not 100% the expert by any means on Kubernetes RBAC, but with a pod label specifier, I believe that there's no way of controlling who can or who can't add that sort of pod label annotation. So for example, if you've got a service called service A with an annotation on it, is there anything that would stop me adding the same annotation to my service B? And therefore, basically, I become, my service instance has become part of this identity binding. So like, I don't believe you can control that in RBAC. I think you can with OPA. So that's fine. But that's just that's a kind of a question and a things like, so is using pod label specifications, TLDR is kind of like a thing, is it possible to then masquerade or act as kind of like a man in the middle? And does that kind of potentially compromise the security? I think the answer is if that's an already used convention, that it shouldn't be SMI to say that you can't do that. But certainly we wouldn't want to expose a lower level of security than we already have by implementing this particular feature of the spec. So could we therefore implement identity binding, but only a subset of the features? And how do we kind of manage that in terms of compliance and stuff?
Right. Those are great questions. And I've thought about both of them. So in particular, I'm going to start with your first point first. So the way I envision identity binding being used is that the mesh implementations themselves wouldn't necessarily need to create identity bindings. The way I see this being used are for cluster operators to essentially tell SMI what what identities are part of my service. And in particular, traffic target for source and destination has that kind, right? You can set us, and we only really define it for service account. I envision identity binding being an alternative for service account. We're able to say, hey, for this particular policy that I'm laying out in traffic target, these identities are for source and identities for destination. And that will allow something like the Istio SMI controller or Linkerd internally or OSM internally to be able to then look at that identity binding and then only use what it needs to. So in the case of Istio, Istio can use specific identities for source and destination. It also, for the only way that you can specify a destination sorry, yeah, the only way you can specify a destination for like when this authorization policy applies is through a Kubernetes pod label spec. Linker D has a similar CRD to identity binding. It's called server, and then it's described in the doc, and then the policy piece of it is called server policy. Within server, you have a pod label spec along with some ports that essentially that you then use within this within the server authorization as your you've got your client, and then you've got the server that the policy takes place on. And so I'd say that to your second point, I'd say that using Kubernetes like label specs is a used pattern within meshes, and that's kind of the main reason for for it being within identity binding. But I think the kind of the goal behind the spec is that as a cluster operator, I have control over what I want my identity to be. If I want it to only be spiffy, then I can only make it spiffy. If I only want it to be service account, I can keep it service account.
So I'm 100% behind that. I think that's absolutely the right way to go. And I'm not saying we don't do pod label specifiers, because I think if there is an established pattern, we absolutely 1000% have to support that. Mm-hmm. The only kind of facet around my question was, in a multi-tenanted environment, is there a way of restricting through Kubernetes RBAC the pod label that I apply to my pod of my deployment? Because if there isn't, then potentially I can abuse the pod label specification to kind of create a like a man in the middle of masquerade, a service instance, and for therefore it to be a spoof service to become part of the group. So like that I don't think is a problem for SMI. It's not a something that SMI should mandate. I don't believe we're here to kind of advise on best use of security, but if that is a possible situation, as I say, like certainly that would present, in Consul's instance, that would present a lower level of security than what we already have. Therefore, we would like to implement spiffy identity, service accounts as part of identity binding, but we wouldn't implement the pod labels selector part of identity binding.
Right. And so I think with the multi-tenant environment, I believe you can, what you would do there from an RBAC perspective is to lock down that namespace. So you can't do, even though you couldn't, I don't think you can restrict annotation changes within the same namespace. Like if you've got access to the pods on namespace, you have access to the pods on namespace. But between namespaces, I think you can say you can't patch any of the pods in this namespace.
Okay. So in that instance, then the identity binding, the namespace that is used would have, sorry, let me start again. The namespace that's defined in the identity binding CRD not only is just the namespace of where the identity binding exists in Kubernetes, but any controller which is reading this CRD should apply pod label selectors, spiffy identities, or service accounts to that namespace as well. So it's down to the implementation to kind of get that security model right. But what we're saying is that namespace is coupled with pod label specification. So it's pod workloads with app service A in the namespace default. It's spiffy identities, cluster.local in the namespace default. Is that how you're thinking?
Yes, I think that's correct, because I think it's too much of a breach of security to try to have identity binding be cluster wide. That wouldn't work multi-tenant.
Yes. Okay, excellent. So then in that case, like I don't think we would have we'd have a problem. I suppose it's down to the individual how they use that, but like if it applies on namespace. But I do think we need to call that out, because I think there's a potential mistake that could be made around the implementation. But absolutely. This is brilliant. Honestly, really good, man.
Thank you. I'll make a comment on namespace just to make sure when I write up the actual PR for the CRD and everything that that's called out in the documentation. That's good. That's really necessary. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, likewise, from my perspective, this. Oh, sorry, you can go, Bridget.
Oh, no, I was very glad that we got some resolution there. And there was no way I was going to transcribe all of that. So I'm going to put a note in the notes saying, watch the video if you want a lot more detail. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so likewise, from my perspective, I think that this looks really solid. My line of question is this: there's two parts of like one. I would like to see a little bit more detail on how it relates to traffic target. So maybe that's already in the traffic target document, and I just haven't revisited it in a few weeks. But just like how traffic target would use the identity binding. And two, I'm assuming this is a thing that like has not been considered yet, but I'm curious if it is a point worth like exploring, is how it might interact with gateway API spec backend graph, which is basically a point of extension from the gateway API spec that allows pointing to a cube object of some sort, which could be like the identity binding CRD if it's appropriate there, as a backend for an API gateway to direct traffic to. So I can drop some links into the notes. But yeah, I think that there's an interesting potential there to help standardize some of like where gateway API spec ends and where mesh things begin.
I think I answered the first part of your question, Mike. I've got no idea on the API gateway stuff. That's you're probably more of an expert than anybody. But for the first part, in traffic target, at the moment, identity is kind of very loose. So it's you can specify that it's a service account, what the service account name is, but it's also it was always left there open for extension, because when originally that was written, we were like, this is not the finite way that this should be. It's kind of like, this is the best, a best approach for now, but we need to look at this at a later date, and it was never looked at. So I think we can probably just add like a type as such, so that you could either specify that it is a service account or an identity binding, and then the name would be fine. But I do think that what we should also do is we should look at moving the spec forward. So we keep backward compatibility for a little while, supporting service account and identity binding, but we should also look at deprecating service account as a direct reference inside of traffic target or traffic access, and we should move to directly referencing identity binding, because it's cleaner, it's clearer, and I think that gives us a nice progression into kind of identity binding.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with that. Mike, does that answer? I think that by your emoji, I take it to mean that answered your question.
Answers the first half of the question.
The first half, yeah.
I'm dropping notes into your doc about some of the questions I had about gateway API stuff. So.
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate those links. And yeah, I as far as kind of bringing this all full circle back on the traffic target, I wanted to make sure that I let the traffic target proposal doc breathe a bit before trying to, I put a link to the proposal, but I didn't want anybody by any means to think that this was the only thing we could possibly do if somebody else had an idea. So I'm going to wait to that 25th date and then flesh out the proposals a bit more, and maybe give one more opportunity for anybody from the community to hop in and give a second opinion, and let other folks like Linkerd and OSM to take a look at it, and see where their use cases might fit in, and then start working on a PR to advance this forward. And this would be V1 Alpha 4 of traffic access group. So moving forward there.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. And I did ping the OSM team out of band, and hopefully I can get them to comment on that issue, or rather on that doc. Okay, do we have anything more on this topic before we take a quick look at a few other topics? We're good. Okay. I just have a quick question. It might be for Lee. That the community member was asking on CNCF Slack about on the SMI channel about mentorship. And I was like, did we do that this time? And I went and I looked and I did see one in there that looks like Lee is the mentor. And can you, if this is still going on, can you maybe answer that person over on the channel, or what's your thinking?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I didn't notice the question. Yeah, that's in the CNCF Slack SMI channel.
Yes, let me double check that and make sure that I'm in the right place. Yes, Monday, February 7th. Someone
Nice.
said SMI is participating in the LFX mentorship program and they're interested to apply. And after reading the description, they don't know what's happening with it. And I thought, I don't know if they're talking about this one or a different one, but if you think this is the one they're talking about, maybe give
Nice.
them
Yeah,
a quick answer in the channel just so that they feel acknowledged and
got it. Yeah. Thank you for, yeah.
awesome. Thank you. And then Nick, thank you so much for joining us. And I am going to put you on the spot and say, hey, in the time we have left, do you want to maybe give us a little bit of thoughts on what's going on with traffic split and HTTP route group updates?
Yes. I'm still not 100% sort of clear, other than I think we need to make breaking changes. I think the last time we chatted, Keith, you remember we were looking at this and it just kind of like, it felt like it needed to be overhauled. And I think the only way we can really overhaul it is to make a breaking change, but I don't have a proposal on what that change would be. I'm going to float something different up here though, which kind of ties into that, which is, I was just kind of writing up in that document there that we're some stuff around V1 Alpha 4 and how we should deprecate the traffic access section around sources when we implement Keith's identity binding, assuming that gets carried. I can't see why it wouldn't, but so the question is, because we potentially need to make that change, and that's a breaking change from a backward compatibility perspective, and we also need to make the kind of the traffic target changes. Should we look at rolling both of those things up and also look at moving towards beta 1, which would allow us to kind of make any breaking changes that we need? So we'll introduce identity binding with Alpha v4, but let's look at moving to deprecating the sources to the new model and revisiting the design for traffic routing and moving to beta 1, because we've been in alpha for like ever. So if we address these two things, are we kind of ready for a beta? And therefore, like, because we need to make a breaking change, like alpha to beta is actually an acceptable API change to do that break. What's folks' thoughts on that?
Hear beta and I think finally, yes. If we're ready to start moving forward on that, that's really exciting.
Yeah, I'm on board. I've actually, independently from Nick, I've been taking a look at those same traffic spec changes. I think I was assigned a couple of issues in GitHub on the SMI spec page, and I agree that a breaking change is needed. It became that consensus before. And actually, I think at the last meeting I had a discussion topic of what will it take to get us to beta, and I love Nick's plan there because I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it'll be a big signal to the community as well of SMI's growth and improvement.
Yeah, I think if we're looking at like breaking changes and like kind of filling out some of the existing gaps there, I would love to take a look at what is there currently and like what we need from the perspective of gateway APIs like HTTP route, which I believe is a vaguely similar construct that attempts to address some of these problems.
It's actually a very similar construct because Tim Hockin actually drew influence from some of the definitions that we had around traffic target, which went into V1 networking and the gateway API spec. Yeah, they're very, very, very similar.
So yeah, I think my question is like, is there things we could pull back from there to like resolve some of the like gaps that we have? Or I guess this is like a bigger stretch of like, is it worth using something which does have traction and like using their definition from their CRD or something for that potentially?
I think that is a wonderful question. And I almost feel like linking you to the GitHub issue where I asked a very similar version of that about 18 months ago. Yeah, but I think that's a really sensible thing because we're talking about doing a bunch of work around the traffic routing. So I think another thing that we should put on the table is, should we and could we completely deprecate traffic routing with the aim of adopting V1 networking's specifications? So can we make SMI work and with those specifications, because they are incredibly similar.
And that's where I'm spending all of my time currently. So I would be very interested in like helping move that part forward.
I like that idea a lot. We are just about out of time. So I'm going to call it there, but I am going to say I will be unavailable during the meeting time slot on March 2nd. So if we can have someone who wants to volunteer to run this call, that would be fantastic. And I'll make sure that you have the code for recording. So Nick, fantastic. I will put Nick down as the mod for next time. And I look forward to seeing where this discussion goes. And maybe next time there'll actually be time for issue triage. But hey, if you want to take some issue triage home with you as a fun take home for the next 2 weeks, go ahead and click in there. Thanks, folks. And our next meeting will be March 2nd. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Okay.
See y'all.